Tickets, please. The flight attendant's smile didn't reach her eyes. Something was off. Alana handed over their first-class passes, but the woman lingered, staring, a silent accusation hanging in the air. Daniel felt the familiar sting of prejudice, that quiet hum of, "You don't belong." Their anniversary trip, a carefully planned escape to Paris, was about to become a battle. A battle for what? Dignity? Respect? It ran deeper. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Alana wasn't just a black woman in first class. She was a doctor, a regulator, and she wasn't about to let this go. These people have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. But the crew's victory was short-lived. They made one catastrophic mistake. They didn't just insult a loving couple. They illegally ejected two of the most powerful people in aviation. What followed wasn't just a complaint, it was a reckoning. The hum of Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport was a familiar symphony to Daniel Harris. It was a soundscape of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the palpable energy of 1,000 different journeys, beginning or ending. For him, however, this journey was different. It wasn't for work. It wasn't a last-minute deployment to an audit site or a tense regulatory hearing. This was personal. Beside him, his wife, Dr. Alana Harris, adjusted the strap of her carry-on, a small, serene smile playing on her lips. For their 15th anniversary, they had planned the kind of trip they always helped make possible for others, but rarely took themselves a luxurious 2-week escape to Paris. They'd booked seats 2A and 2B in the Polaris first-class cabin on Global Air's Flight 112 to Charles de Gaulle. It was an indulgence, but one they felt they had earned. Daniel, at 48, was a man carved from quiet authority. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his suit, though comfortable for travel, was impeccably tailored. He possessed a calm, observant demeanor that could be easily mistaken for aloofness. In reality, he was a listener, a man who absorbed details others missed. For the past 20 years, he'd worked his way up through the Federal Aviation Administration. He was now a senior air carrier safety inspector, one of the people responsible for ensuring that airlines like Global Air adhered to the letter of every single federal regulation. His word could ground fleets. Alana was his perfect complement. A PhD in aerospace engineering and a medical doctor, she was a leading FAA consultant on human factors and aeromedical standards. She studied the intricate dance between pilot, machine, and environment, writing the protocols that kept crews alert and passengers safe. Her brilliance was matched only by her grace. She exuded a warmth and intelligence that immediately put people at ease. They had earned this. The long nights, the missed dinners, the constant travel, it had all been for a shared purpose, to make the skies safer. Now for 2 weeks, the skies were just for them. "Ready for 14 days of no regulations?" Alana whispered, her eyes sparkling. Daniel squeezed her hand. "I'll try my best not to inspect the pre-flight safety briefing too critically." They laughed, a private, easy sound between two people who knew each other's souls. They approached the priority boarding lane, their documents in hand. The gate agent, a harried-looking man, scanned their passes without a second glance. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. and Dr. Harris." As they stepped onto the jet bridge, the sterile airport air gave way to the climate-controlled atmosphere of the Boeing 77. A flight attendant stood at the door, greeting passengers with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard." "Good morning," Daniel said, showing her their boarding passes. "We're in 2A and 2B. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Karen Miller, glanced at the passes, then back at them. Her smile didn't falter, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in her eyes. It was a flicker of something, reassessment, confusion. "Right this way," she said, her tone a fraction cooler than it had been for the passengers ahead of them. They found their seats spacious pods upholstered in dark navy leather. They were beautiful, private, and promised a comfortable journey across the Atlantic. As they stowed their bags in the overhead compartments, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of Karen Miller's gaze on them. It wasn't the attentive look of good service. It felt like surveillance. Alana, ever perceptive, noticed his slight unease. "Everything okay?" "Fine," he said, settling into his seat and forcing a smile. He wouldn't let a strange vibe from a single crew member spoil this. It was probably nothing, just the stress of the job. He knew from his work that flight attendants had 1,000 things on their minds during boarding. A few minutes later, Karen Miller arrived at their pod holding a silver tray with 2 glasses of champagne. Her smile was back, but it seemed painted on a brittle facade. Pre-aperture champagne, she asked, her voice high and a little too loud. Thank you. That would be lovely, Alana said warmly. As Karen handed them the glasses, her eyes roamed over them again, taking in Alana's simple but elegant dress and Daniel's tailored suit. She seemed to be searching for something, a clue that didn't fit the picture she had in her mind. Are you too familiar with the Polaris cabin? She asked. We are, Daniel replied politely. Thank you. She lingered for a moment too long. It's just we sometimes have passengers who are upgraded at the last minute and aren't sure how everything works. We want to make sure everyone is comfortable. The implication was clear, hanging in the air like stale perfume. You look like you were upgraded. You don't look like you belong here. Daniel felt a familiar, weary tightening in his chest. He'd felt this before in boardrooms, at inspections in restaurants. It was the soft bigotry of low expectations, the quiet questioning of his presence in spaces where some people didn't expect to see a black man. He chose, as he often did, the path of least resistance. Let it go. It's our anniversary. We appreciate that, he said, his voice even and calm. We're all set. Karen finally retreated, but as she walked away, Daniel saw her stop and speak in a low voice to the purser at the front of the cabin, a man named Mark Jensen. They both glanced back towards Daniel and Alana's seats. Mark's expression hardened. The quiet anticipation Daniel had felt at the gate was beginning to curdle into a cold dread. This wasn't just a flight attendant having a bad day. This was the beginning of something ugly. The cabin door was sealed and the captain's voice came over the intercom, a smooth, confident baritone announcing a flight time of 9 hours and 40 minutes to Paris. Daniel tried to settle in to recapture the celebratory mood. He took a sip of champagne and looked at Alana, who was attempting to focus on the in-flight magazine, though he could see the tension in the set of her jaw. The purser Mark Jensen began his own welcome tour of the first-class cabin. He was a man in his late 50s with a meticulously maintained coif of silver hair and an air of self-importance. He greeted a businessman across the aisle by name, sharing a brief, hearty laugh. He spent several minutes chatting with an older couple in the row behind them. When he arrived at their pod, the bonhomie vanished. His smile was thin, his posture rigid. Mr. and Mrs. Harris, is it? He began, his tone dripping with false civility. He didn't wait for a reply. I'm Mark Jensen, the purser for this flight. I just need to verify your seat assignments one more time. Daniel held up his boarding pass. We're in 2A and 2B. Mark barely glanced at it. Yes, I see that. It's just that there appears to be some sort of discrepancy in our system. We have these seats marked for other passengers who may have been rerouted. It's a common computer glitch. Daniel knew airline reservation systems inside and out. While glitches happened, they were rarely of this nature, and they were almost always sorted out at the gate, not after the cabin was secured for departure. This was a fabrication, and a clumsy one at that. I can assure you our tickets are confirmed, Daniel said, his voice remaining level professional. We booked them 2 months ago. Be that as it may, Mark continued, his voice hardening. I need to see your ticket receipts, the purchase confirmation. This was a highly unusual request. A boarding pass was the final authority. Alana looked up from her magazine, her expression one of polite but firm disbelief. Is there a problem, Mr. Jensen? Dr. Harris, actually. Alana corrected him gently. Mark's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, as if this detail further complicated the narrative he was building in his head. Mom, I'm simply trying to ensure everyone is in their correctly assigned seat. Airline policy. Karen Miller reappeared at his elbow, a silent, smirking reinforcement. They stood there, blocking the aisle, creating a scene. The businessman across the way lowered his newspaper, watching with unconcealed curiosity. The cabin, once a space of quiet luxury, was now charged with a tense, accusatory energy. My husband has already shown you our boarding passes, Alana said, her voice still soft, but now edged with steel. We also showed them at the gate. If there's a system glitch, perhaps it's something to take up with the ground crew when we land. I'm afraid I can't wait until we land, Mark said, his patience snapping. He was dropping the pretense of customer service. There's a possibility you are in possession of fraudulent boarding passes. The word hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Fraudulent. Daniel felt a surge of cold fury, but years of training in high-stakes environments took over. Emotion was a liability. Facts were the weapon. Mr. Jensen, Daniel said, his voice low and deliberate, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. We are ticketed passengers in our assigned seats. You are making a serious accusation without a shred of evidence. A young woman in seat 3G, who had been watching the exchange with growing horror, leaned forward. For goodness sake, leave them alone. They haven't done anything. Mark shot her a withering glare. Mom, please remain out of official crew business. He turned back to Daniel and Alana. Your receipts now, or I will have to involve the captain. This was the final escalation before the point of no return. Daniel knew it. They were being challenged, tested, and deliberately humiliated. The accusation wasn't about a computer glitch. It was about the fact that he and Alana, in the minds of Mark and Karen, could not possibly have afforded or deserved to be in first class. They had to be fakes, frauds, or beneficiaries of some mistake that needed correcting. Alana pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly. She wasn't flustered. She was methodical. She opened her email and found the booking confirmation from Global Air, complete with the transaction ID and the last 4 digits of the credit card used for the purchase. She held the phone out to Mark. Here is the confirmation email from your airline sent the day we purchased these tickets. As you can see, they are fully paid for. Now, are we finished with this interrogation? Mark glanced at the phone, his face flushing. The clear digital proof momentarily thwarted him. He had expected them to have no answer, to become flustered and angry to give him the excuse he needed. But their calm, factual response only seemed to infuriate him more. He couldn't accept that he was wrong. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hiss. I don't know what game you're playing. Maybe you used the stolen credit card. Maybe your employee's trying to pull a fast one. But this flight doesn't move until I get to the bottom of this. Karen Miller chimed in, her voice sacking with malice. We have to protect the integrity of the cabin. Mark, we can't have, well, gate lice. The slur, a derogatory term for people who crowd a gate hoping for an upgrade they don't deserve, was the final straw. It was a direct, undisguised insult. Daniel slowly placed his champagne flute on the tray. The time for de-escalation was over. They had crossed a line. Mr. Jensen, you have 2 options. Daniel said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. It was the voice he used when grounding an aircraft. You can return to your duties and we will discuss your conduct with your superiors when we land in Paris, or you can call the captain as you threatened. But understand this, if you choose the second option, you will be initiating a sequence of events that you will not be able to control. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, a professional assessment of the situation. Mark, blinded by his own arrogance, heard it only as a challenge. His face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. Oh, I'll call the captain. We'll see who's in control here. He turned on his heel and strode purposefully toward the cockpit, Karen trailing him like a loyal viper. Daniel and Alana sat in a pocket of stunned silence, the eyes of the entire first-class cabin fixed upon them. The anniversary trip to Paris was over before the plane had even pushed back from the gate. The few minutes that followed felt like an eternity. The low hum of the auxiliary power unit was the only sound, a monotonous drone against the backdrop of silent, awkward stares from the other passengers. Daniel and Alana didn't speak. They simply sat composed and resolute, a silent island in a sea of tension. They had presented the facts. They had remained professional. Now the system they had dedicated their lives to upholding would either work or it would fail spectacularly. The cockpit door opened and Mark Jensen emerged, his face flushed with vindication. Behind him was Captain Robert Evans. The captain was the picture of authority, tall, silver-haired with 4 gold stripes on his epaulettes. But as he approached their seats, his expression was not one of impartial investigation. It was one of annoyance of a man whose routine had been inconveniently interrupted. He wasn't there to listen. He was there to solve a problem created by his crew. And the easiest solution was to remove the source of the friction. Folks, Captain Evans began his voice carrying an easy, dismissive authority. He didn't make eye contact with Daniel or Alana, instead addressing the space between them. I'm Captain Evans. My purser tells me there's some confusion about your seating. Captain, there is no confusion, Daniel stated clearly. There is, however, an accusation of fraud being leveled against my wife and me by your crew. We have shown our boarding passes and our purchase confirmation. We are in our assigned paid-for seats. The captain finally looked at him, but his eyes were cold, unreceptive. He had already made his decision, siding with his crew before hearing a single word. In his mind, the hierarchy was clear. His trusted purser of 15 years versus two unknown passengers. Look, I don't have time to sort out ticketing disputes on the tarmac, Captain Evans said dismissively. My purser, Mr. The Jensen, is responsible for the integrity of the cabin manifest. If he says there's a problem, there's a problem. We have a schedule to keep. Alana leaned forward, her voice sharp and precise, the voice of a doctor delivering a difficult diagnosis. Captain, are you saying you are refusing to look at our legal documentation? That you are taking the unsubstantiated word of your crew over documented proof? What I'm saying, Mom, the captain retorted, his tone becoming patronizing, is that this discussion is over? The safety and security of this flight are my paramount concern. A disruptive situation in the cabin before we even take off is a security concern. We are not being disruptive, Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. We are sitting in our seats being harassed. That's a matter of perspective, Captain Evans said, crossing his arms. My crew feels threatened. You've become belligerent. It was a masterful, insidious trap. By calmly defending themselves against baseless accusations, they were now being labeled as the aggressors. Their refusal to be silently humiliated was being reframed as belligerent. So here's what's going to happen. The captain continued his decision. And final. I'm going to have to ask you to deplane. You can sort this out with the gate agents. They'll get you on the next available flight once your ticketing is verified. A collective quiet gasp went through the cabin. The woman in 3G shook her head in disgust. The businessman across the aisle looked down, suddenly intensely interested in his shoes. No one spoke up. The humiliation was absolute. It was no longer a private dispute. It was a public verdict delivered by the ultimate authority on the aircraft. They were being declared guilty and sentenced to removal. Captain Evans. Daniel said, his voice now resonating with an authority of its own, though the source of it was still unknown to everyone in the cabin. I want you to be very sure about this. You are invoking your captain's authority under Federal Aviation Regulation 91.3 to remove paying ticketed passengers based on the unverified claims of your crew. Is that correct? The specific citation of the regulation gave the captain a moment's pause. It was an unusual thing for a passenger to know, but his pride and his blind trust in his crew overrode any flicker of caution. That's correct. Now, are you going to leave peacefully, or do I need to call for airport security? He threatened. Daniel looked at Alana. Her expression was one of deep disappointment, but also of unyielding strength. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. This battle was lost. The war, however, had just begun. Slowly, with a dignity that stood in stark contrast to the ugliness of the situation, Daniel and Alana stood up. They retrieved their bags from the overhead compartment, their movements deliberate and unhurried. Every eye in the cabin was on them. They could feel the mix of pity, discomfort, and for some, perhaps, a cruel sense of satisfaction. As they started the long walk back up the aisle, Mark Jensen and Karen Miller stood near the galley, arms crossed, their expressions triumphant. Karen had a small, vicious smirk on her face. They had won. They had identified the imposters, the people who didn't belong, and they had purged them from their silver sanctuary in the sky. The walk from seat 2B to the aircraft door was the longest walk of Daniel Harris's life. It was a gauntlet of shame designed to break them. But as he passed row after row of silent witnesses, he wasn't broken. He was documenting. He logged every detail, the captain's exact words, the person's smug expression, the averted eyes of the other passengers, the location of every camera in the cabin. He was no longer a husband on an anniversary trip. He was an inspector at a crash site, piecing together the chain of events that led to a catastrophic failure. This failure wasn't mechanical, it was human, and it was every bit as dangerous. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, the cabin door closing behind them with a final definitive thud, the cold night air hit them. They were alone, standing on a brightly lit bridge to nowhere. Their Parisian dream replaced by the harsh reality of what had just happened. They had been judged, condemned, and ejected, all because the color of their skin did not match the crew's idea of a first-class passenger. Back in the terminal, the gate area was mostly empty. The flight to Paris was the last major departure of the evening. The gate agent who had checked them in earlier looked up, his expression a mixture of confusion and annoyance at their reappearance. "Folks, the flight's closed. What happened?" Before Daniel or Alana could speak, the agent's phone rang. He listened for a moment, his eyes darting towards them. "Uh-huh. Okay, Captain, I understand." He hung up, his demeanor now cold and official. "Captain Evans informs me you were removed for being disruptive. I need to rebook you. The next flight with available first-class seats to Paris is in 2 days." "We were not disruptive," Alana said calmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We were targeted and harassed by the crew." The agent sighed, typing into his computer. "Look, ma'am, all I know is what the captain tells me. His word is final on the aircraft. I can offer you a hotel voucher and meal coupons, but that's the best I can do." He slid the vouchers across the counter, a dismissive, bureaucratic gesture meant to end the conversation. This was the moment they could have become angry passengers demanding to speak to a supervisor, threatening lawsuits, their voices rising in justifiable frustration. This is what the airline system was designed to handle: absorb the anger process, the complaint, and issue a token apology with some travel vouchers. But Daniel and Alana Harris didn't do that. Daniel calmly took out his phone. He ignored the vouchers on the counter. He looked at the gate agent, then at the Global Air logos all around them. He took a deep, steadying breath. "We won't be needing those," he said quietly. He then turned away from the counter and walked a few paces down the empty corridor, Alana standing by his side. He scrolled through his contacts, past Alana, past his mother, past his friends, and stopped on a number labeled FAA Duty Officer, SW Region. He pressed the call button. Alana watched him, her heart pounding. They had talked about this moment in abstract terms many times over their careers. What would happen if they ever personally witnessed a major violation while traveling as civilians? They had hoped it would never happen. Now it had. The phone was answered on the second ring. FAA Southwest Region Duty Office. Agent Carmichael speaking. Daniel's voice when he spoke was transformed. The weary traveler was gone. The humiliated husband was gone. In his place was FAA Inspector Daniel Harris, badge number 772A. "Agent Carmichael, this is Inspector Harris. I need you to listen to me very carefully." Daniel said, his tone clipped and official. "I am at Houston Intercontinental Gate D12. My wife, Dr. Rana Harris, and I have just been unlawfully deplaned from Global Air Flight 112, AO designation GBL12, a Boeing 737-300ER tail number N791GA. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then the sound of frantic typing. "Inspector Harris, sir," confirmed. "What is the nature of the incident?" The flight crew, specifically Purser Mark Jensen and flight attendant Karen Miller, refused to accept our valid ticketed boarding passes for seats 2A and 2B. They accused us of fraud without cause. When we presented digital proof of purchase, they escalated their harassment. We were subsequently removed from the aircraft by the pilot in command, Captain Robert Evans, under a false pretense of disruptive behavior. The captain refused to verify our documentation and cited crew safety as the reason for our removal. Daniel paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "Agent Carmichael, I am officially declaring this a discriminatory incident in direct violation of Title 49 of the United States Code Section 41137, prohibiting discrimination by air carriers. Furthermore, the captain's failure to perform due diligence before removing ticketed passengers constitutes a gross neglect of duty and a potential violation of the carrier's operating certificate under 14 CFR Part 121. The agent on the phone was audibly stunned. "My God, sir. Understood. What are your instructions? I want you to immediately contact the Principal Operations Inspector for Global Air. I want a full transcript of the cockpit voice recorder from the moment the purser entered the cockpit to the moment the cabin door was closed. I want the names and FAA certificate numbers for the entire flight crew. Captain Evans, the first officer, Mr. Jensen, and Ms. Miller. I want the airline to preserve all internal cabin security footage. Dr. Harris and I will be filing a formal report. Consider Global Air's Houston operations under immediate and intense scrutiny. We are initiating a full compliance investigation effective immediately. Daniel concluded the call and turned to Alana. The anger and humiliation were still there, simmering beneath the surface, but they were now channeled into a cold, focused resolve. The power dynamic had shifted with a single phone call. They were no longer victims of the system. They were the system itself. The gate agent, who had been watching them with growing unease, saw the look on their faces and felt a sudden chill. These were not ordinary passengers. His dismissive attitude evaporated, replaced by a dawning horror. Daniel walked back to the counter. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held up his federal credentials. The gold FAA inspector's badge gleamed under the harsh terminal lighting. My name is Daniel Harris. This is Dr. Alana Harris. We are with the Federal Aviation Administration. He said, his voice flat and hard as granite. You, your flight crew, and your airline have a very serious problem. You will not be rebooking our flight. You will be securing our luggage, which is currently on a plane that is about to push back from the gate. You will then find your station manager and a representative from Global Air's corporate office because they need to be here to meet with us now. The gate agent stared at the badge, his face turning pale. He looked from Daniel to Alana, and for the first time he saw them not as disgruntled passengers, but as what they were, two of the most powerful regulators in the aviation industry. The people who held the fate of his airline in their hands. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking. Yes, sir. Right away, sir. The anniversary trip to Paris was officially canceled. A federal investigation had just begun. The first domino toppled at 10:47 p.m. Central Time in Global Air's sprawling operations center near Dallas, a high-tech nerve center known internally as the Bridge. A senior dispatcher received an alert, a digital flag so rare and so serious that most controllers went their entire careers without seeing one. It was a direct line communication from the FAA's Southwest Regional Office, tagged with the highest priority code, regulatory intervention. The dispatcher, a veteran named Stan, read the initial report and felt his blood run cold. It wasn't about a mechanical failure, a weather diversion, or a security threat. It was about two passengers being removed from Flight 112 in Houston, and those two passengers were FAA. Get me Jessica Riley, Stan barked to his supervisor. Now Jessica Riley, the vice president of in-flight services for Global Air, was at a charity dinner, her phone on silent. But she wore a smartwatch for exactly these kinds of emergencies. It buzzed insistently, displaying a single terrifying message from her chief of staff. Code red FLT112IH FAA, call immediately. Excusing herself from the table, Jessica stepped into a quiet hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She listened as the frantic supervisor from the bridge explained the situation, an accusation of fraud, a removal by the captain, and the two passengers were not just FAA, they were Daniel Harris and Dr. Alana Harris. Jessica's mind raced. She didn't need to look them up. She knew exactly who they were. Daniel Harris was a legend, a tough but fair inspector who had personally overseen Global Air's last major safety audit. He was meticulous, unshakable, and had the entire code of federal regulations memorized. Dr. Alana Harris was even more daunting. She was a titan in the field of aeromedical science and human factors. Her research on crew fatigue and bias had literally rewritten the industry's training manuals. Her crew hadn't just mistreated two black passengers. They had, through sheer catastrophic ignorance, accosted and ejected the very regulators who wrote and enforced the rules that allowed their planes to fly. Lock it down, Jessica commanded, her voice, a strained whisper. No one, and I mean no one from that flight crew, talks to the union or the media. Get the Houston station manager to Daniel and Alana's location immediately. Treat them like royalty, no better than royalty. Treat them like they can shut us down with a single phone call because they can. I'm on my way to the airport. She hung up and leaned against the wall, the gravity of the situation crashing down on her. This wasn't a customer service complaint that could be smoothed over with miles and an apology letter. This was a potential multi-million-dollar fine. It was a consent decree. It was a public relations apocalypse. It was the kind of incident that could lead to congressional hearings. And it all happened because a flight crew couldn't fathom a black couple sitting in first class. Meanwhile, at 37,000 Holland feet over the Atlantic, the crew of Flight 1 and 12 was oblivious. In the forward galley with the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers asleep, Karen Miller and Mark Jensen were quietly congratulating themselves. "You handled that perfectly, Mark," Karen said, pouring them both a cup of coffee. They were so sure of themselves, the arrogance. "It's always the way," Mark agreed, stirring his coffee with a sense of deep satisfaction. "They think they can bully their way in, but we have to maintain standards." Captain Evans saw it right away. He knew they were trouble. "Disruptive and belligerent," Karen added, savoring the words the captain had used. "That's exactly what they were. We protected the cabin. We did our job." In their minds, they were heroes. They had defended the sanctity of their premium cabin from intruders. They had enforced the unspoken rules of who belongs and who doesn't. They settled in for a quiet, routine flight, completely unaware that on the ground below, an inferno was erupting, and they were standing at its epicenter. Their careers were already over. They just didn't know it yet. Back in Houston, Daniel and Alana were in a private lounge, a sterile corporate room. The panicked station manager had quickly opened for them. They had given their preliminary statements over a recorded line to the FAA duty officer. They were calm, professional, and devastatingly precise. They recounted every word, every gesture, every nuance of the escalating hostility. Alana, with her expertise in human factors, detailed the clear evidence of confirmation bias and stereotyping exhibited by the crew. Daniel laid out the procedural and regulatory violations point by point. Their luggage had been retrieved from the plane just moments before it pushed back. Two senior global air executives from the Dallas headquarters were now in a company car racing down the highway to Houston to meet them in person. Daniel looked at Alana, the exhaustion of the ordeal finally settling in his eyes. "Happy anniversary, my love." Alana reached across the table and took his hand. "We're in this together, Daniel. Always." There was no talk of Paris, of champagne, of museums. That dream had been shattered. But in its place was a shared steely purpose. What had been intended as a personal humiliation was about to become a professional crucible. They would take this ugly, painful experience and use it to force the change they had dedicated their lives to. They would ensure that no one else ever had to endure a walk of shame for the simple crime of existing in a space where they were not expected. The dominoes were falling, and they were about to bring the whole house down. 9 hours later, Flight 1 on 12 descended through a blanket of gray clouds, beginning its approach into Charles de Gaulle Airport. For the passengers, it was the end of a long but uneventful journey. For Captain Robert Evans and his crew, it was the beginning of the end. As the Boeing 77 taxied toward the gate, Captain Evans made his standard, cheerful arrival announcement. "On behalf of Global Air and this entire crew, I'd like to be the first to welcome you to Paris. We hope you enjoyed your flight, and we look forward to seeing you on board again soon." In the forward galley, Karen Miller and Mark Jensen prepared for disembarking, their faces relaxed. They were anticipating a pleasant 3-day layover in one of the world's most beautiful cities. The jet bridge docked with a soft bump. The engine spooled down. Mark Jensen moved to open the main cabin door, a routine he'd performed thousands of times. But this time was different. Standing on the jet bridge instead of the usual gaggle of ground crew were two stern-faced men in dark suits. And to Mark's utter shock, Jessica Riley, the vice president of in-flight services. Jessica was a corporate legend, a name you saw in memos, not a face you saw on a jet bridge in Paris at 7 a.m. Her expression was arctic. "Mark," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Keep the passengers on board, the entire flight crew, Captain Evans, his first officer. You and Ms. Miller will come with me now." Mark's triumphant smirk from 9 hours ago felt like a distant memory. It was replaced by a wave of cold confusion. "Jessica, what is this? Is something wrong?" "Everything is wrong, Mark," she replied, her eyes boring into him. "Get your crew." The four of them were escorted off the plane down a service stairway and into a windowless briefing room deep within the airport's operations area. The two men in suits who are from Global Aero's corporate security stood by the door. Jessica Riley wasted no time. At approximately 9:35 p.m. Central Time last night, you removed two passengers from Flight 112. I want you to tell me exactly what happened. Captain Evans, you begin. Captain Evans, still radiating an aura of command, was more annoyed than concerned. It was a minor security issue, Jessica. Two passengers were being disruptive, harassing the cabin crew over a ticketing issue. They were becoming belligerent. I made a command decision to deplane them to ensure the safety of the flight. It was a textbook call. Jessica stared at him, her disbelief palpable. A textbook call, Robert. Who are these passengers? I don't know their names, the captain said dismissively. An African-American couple. My purser felt their credentials weren't legitimate. Jessica's gaze shifted to Mark, who stood a little straighter, ready to receive his commendation. Mr. Jensen, tell me why you believe their tickets were fraudulent. Well, Mark began, his tone self-assured. They just didn't seem to fit the profile of our typical first-class clientele. They seemed nervous, and when I questioned them, they became very defensive. It was a gut feeling based on my 25 years of experience. Karen felt it too. Karen nodded eagerly. They had a real attitude when he demanded to see the captain, classic intimidation tactic. We did what we were trained to do, de-escalate by removing the threat. Jessica Riley felt a surge of nausea. Gut feeling, profile, attitude. They were openly admitting to discriminating, but were so blinded by their own prejudice, they were presenting it as good police work. She took a deep breath. It was time to detonate the bomb. The passengers you removed, she began, her voice dropping to an icy whisper, were Daniel and Dr. Alana Harris. The names meant nothing to them. They stared back at her blankly. Jessica continued. Perhaps you know them by their titles. The man you accused of fraud and labeled a threat is FAA Senior Air Carrier Safety Inspector Daniel Harris. He led our last full operational audit. The woman you dismissed and whose professional title you ignored is Dr. Alana Harris, the FAA's leading consultant on human factors and aeromedical standards. Her work is the foundation for half of our crew training manuals. The color drained from their faces. Captain Evans, who had been leaning casually against the table, stood bolt upright. Mark Jensen swayed slightly as if the floor had tilted beneath him. Karen Miller's jaw went slack, her eyes wide with dawning, catastrophic horror. The disruptive passengers you ejected from your aircraft, Jessica said, hitting every word like a hammer blow, are for all intents and purposes the federal government. They are the people who grant us our license to operate, and you didn't just inconvenience them. You committed a series of flagrant violations of federal law on the record in front of a cabin full of witnesses. She held up a tablet and read from a preliminary report. Violation 1. Unlawful discrimination based on race, a direct breach of Title 49 U.S. Code. Violation 2. Failure to follow company and federal protocols for verifying passenger documentation. Violation 3. Captain Evans, your removal of passengers under Regulation 91.3 was based on false information from your crew, which you did not verify, constituting a gross dereliction of your duties as pilot in command. She looked up her face, a mask of cold fury. While you were serving drinks over the Atlantic, Inspector Harris was initiating a full-scale federal investigation into Global Air, starting with this flight. Starting with you, he has already requested the cockpit voice recordings and all cabin footage. Your FAA certificates have been flagged. Your careers as of 9 hours ago are effectively over. Silence. The hum of the room's ventilation system was deafening. The self-congratulatory narrative they had built for themselves had been utterly obliterated, replaced by the terrifying truth. They weren't heroes. They were liabilities. They hadn't protected the cabin. They had potentially crippled the airline. Mark Jensen was the first to break his voice. A pathetic squeak. It was a mistake. A misunderstanding. No, Jessica cut him off. A misunderstanding is getting a drink order wrong. What you did was an act of profound arrogance and prejudice that will now cost this company millions of dollars and could and I pray it doesn't impact our operating certificate. You are all grounded effective immediately. You will be flown back to the U.S. in coach tomorrow to meet with our legal team and FAA investigators. Do not talk to each other. Do not talk to anyone. You are to hand over your company IDs and passports to security. She turned to leave, then paused at the door, delivering one final devastating assessment. You know the truly pathetic thing is, she said, looking directly at Karen and Mark. They probably would have been the most interesting people to talk to on that entire flight, but you couldn't see past your own bigotry to find out. The door clicked shut, leaving the three of them in the sterile room with the security guards there, layover in Paris, transformed into a purgatory of their own making. The hard karma they couldn't have imagined in their wildest nightmares had just landed. The fallout was not swift. It was a slow, meticulous, and crushing avalanche of consequences engineered by the very system the crew had sworn to uphold. For Daniel and Alana Harris, this was never about revenge. It was about rectifying a systemic failure. They recused themselves from the direct investigation to avoid a conflict of interest. But the machine they had set in motion was relentless and thorough. The crew Karen Miller was the first to fall during her interview with the FAA's Office of Civil Rights and Global Air's legal team. She crumbled. Her justifications about gut feelings and passenger profiles were exposed for what they were: textbook racial bias. Her 20-year career ended with a single sterile email from Human Resources informing her of her immediate termination for gross misconduct in violation of company policy and federal law. But the true blow came from the FAA. They found that her actions demonstrated a profound lack of judgment incompatible with the responsibilities of a certified flight attendant. Her FAA Airman certificate was suspended indefinitely with a recommendation for permanent revocation. Unable to work in the industry and facing potential civil lawsuits, her life was irrevocably altered. Mark Jensen, the purser, fared no better. He attempted to shift the blame, claiming he was only following the captain's lead. But the testimony from other passengers, including the young woman from seat 3G, who gave a detailed statement, painted a clear picture of him as the lead instigator. He was fired on the same day as Karen. The FAA revoked his certificate as well, citing his active role in escalating a discriminatory confrontation. His decades of perceived authority vanished overnight, leaving him with nothing but the bitter ashes of his arrogance. Captain Robert Evans faced the most complex reckoning. As the pilot in command, his responsibility was absolute. His failure was not one of malice, but of a catastrophic lapse in judgment, born of complacency and blind trust in his crew. The FAA did not revoke his license immediately. Instead, he was suspended for a year. To ever fly again for a commercial carrier, he was ordered to undergo an exhaustive retraining program personally overseen by a board of FAA inspectors. This included hundreds of hours of sensitivity, training, conflict resolution simulations, and classes on the very regulations he had so casually disregarded. Global Air terminated his command. He would never again be a captain for the airline. If he managed to complete his retraining and get his license fully reinstated, a massive if, the best he could hope for was a first officer position on a regional jet. A humiliating demotion. The 4 gold stripes he wore with such pride were stripped away, a direct result of his failure to look past the uniforms of his crew and see the humanity of his passengers. The airline Global Air was hit with the full force of the regulatory hammer. The investigation spearheaded by Daniel's colleagues unearthed a pattern of inadequately addressed passenger complaints regarding biased treatment. The Flight 112 incident was not an anomaly. It was the symptom of a deep-seated cultural disease. The airline was fined $2.75 million by the FAA, one of the largest fines ever levied for a single discriminatory incident. But the financial penalty was only the beginning. To avoid further potentially crippling sanctions, Global Air entered into a consent decree with the FAA. This legally binding agreement mandated a complete top-to-bottom overhaul of their in-flight service training protocols. They were forced to develop a new training program, a mandatory 40-hour course for all 25,000 of their flight attendants and pilots focused on identifying and combating implicit bias de-escalation techniques based on facts rather than feelings, and the legal ramifications of discrimination. 2. establish an independent oversight committee, a new internal review board with an FAA-appointed monitor to investigate all passenger complaints of discrimination. 3. Implement a no-fault reporting system, a system allowing crew members to report concerns about a colleague's biased behavior without fear of reprisal. And in a move of profound poetic justice, the FAA appointed an external consultant to help design and approve the new curriculum. That consultant was Dr. Alana Harris. She took a leave of absence from her other duties to personally write the playbook that would ensure what happened to her and Daniel would never happen again. The story inevitably leaked to the press. A passenger from the flight anonymously contacted a major news outlet, and the resulting article, First Ass Injustice, Black FAA Inspectors Ejected from Global Air Flight, went viral. The public outcry was immense. Global Air's stock dipped, and for months the airline was the poster child for corporate prejudice. The brand damage was far more costly than the FAA fine. The aftermath. 6 months later, Daniel and Alana Harris finally took their anniversary trip. They flew a different airline. As they settled into their first-class seats, the flight attendant, a young, earnest man, greeted them warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Dr. Harris. Can I get you a glass of champagne to start?" There was no hesitation in his eyes, no flicker of suspicion, just professional courtesy. As the plane took off, soaring above the clouds, Alana looked at Daniel. "It wasn't Paris," she said softly. "No," he replied, taking her hand. "It wasn't. But maybe in the end, it was more important. The ordeal had cost them their dream vacation, but it had fueled their life's mission. Their personal pain had been forged into a powerful instrument of change, creating a ripple effect that would touch every flight, every crew member, and every passenger in the years to come. The karma that had visited Karen Miller, Mark Jensen, and Robert Evans was not just punitive, it was productive. It was a hard, painful, but necessary course correction on the path to ensuring that the skies were safe and open for everyone. The story of Daniel and Alana Harris is a stark reminder that the worst prejudices often hide behind a uniform and a smile. What their tormentors on Flight 1 and 12 forgot is that true authority isn't found in a title or a captain's stripes, but in integrity, truth, and the quiet dignity with which you carry yourself. They thought they were kicking off two people who didn't belong, but they ended up kicking open the door to their own destruction and forcing an entire industry to look in the mirror. Their painful journey became a powerful lesson in justice, a testament to the fact that karma, especially at 35,000 FT, can be swift, severe, and absolute. If this story of justice resonated with you, please let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What part of the crew's reckoning felt the most deserved? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories of when arrogance meets accountability.